Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Caitlin Johnson. I work for the Aerospace Security Project here. I'm very excited to have you all and have our fabulous panelists join us this morning for a conversation about SSA and STM. I will say real quickly, in the event of any kind of emergency, I will be in charge. So I will make sure you guys all get out safely if you just follow my instructions. And with that, I want to welcome Pavia Lal from IDA, Victoria Sampson from the Secure World Foundation, and Audrey Schaefer from OSD Policy. And I think we're going to start with Pavia and her and IDA's newest study on SSA.
Thank you, Caitlin. So in February 2018, a team of researchers at the IDA Science and Technology Policy Institute conducted a study on emerging trends in SSA and STM. We finished the report early this summer, and it's on the website for you all to read. My co-authors, one of them, Asha Balakrishnan, is here, and others hopefully are watching online. Our focus was in this report on global trends in SSA and STM was on trends outside the United States, which means we looked at private entities in the United States, but we did not look at what the government was doing. One thing we learned right away in our study is that terms SSA and STM are fraught. They're used differently. For example, in Europe, SSA includes asteroid detection. So the very first thing we did was just move away from these jargony terms and just focus on the pieces of the process, data collection, data processing, and so forth. And that was really helpful in having good discussions. We identified 18 countries for deep dives. Countries were selected based on their interests, their policies, their depth, how new they were in SSA. We included Russia, China, but we also included countries like Thailand, Poland, and others. We conducted 70 interviews across the world, essentially, mostly outside the United States, just to understand how, what's happening, what are they doing, how much are they investing, and so forth. So I'll go spend a couple minutes talking about our key findings. One thing we learned was that there's growing global investment in SSA, not just in countries like Australia and Japan, but also in countries like Poland and Thailand. As a result, there are growing SSA capabilities around the world. In some cases, the parity is coming not through matching levels of investment or even technology parity, but other innovative approaches, such as use of a larger number of less capable sensors or repurposing sensors used for science. A second finding is related to the fact that there's growing understanding of US weaknesses. Most of the countries around the world know that the US database isn't complete. It doesn't contain some essential information, such as error covariances. It doesn't account for many planned maneuvers, and they do not, and most importantly, they do not get all the data that they wish for. Indeed, it is this lack of transparency that is causing many of the countries to develop more independent SSA systems. These countries see the writing on the wall. They understand that as their dependence on space increases, as a catalog of space objects grows by a factor of 3 to 5, there will be a growing number of false alarms, and they have to be more proactive with respect to protecting their assets. Next, we learned that countries don't just want to receive data and services from the US government, they want to reduce their dependence on US data. This is not to say they don't want to collaborate with the United States, they all do. But even when they want to collaborate, they want a seat at the table, they want to make a contribution, and they want to get better data and information. And again, this was fairly interesting that while all governments around the world, or at least in our case study countries, want to work with the United States, and US data sharing agreements with countries and private sector users and vendors has been increasing, the US is not the only partner of choice. For many countries. Partnerships amongst non-US countries is growing and also fostering greater independence from the United States. Countries, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, South Africa, Chile, and others, are seeing a lot of interest as sites for installing sensors. China, in particular, is growing its optical sensor network called APOSOS, Asia-Pacific Optical Satellite System, through work with its space network, which is the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, APSCO. Another interesting observation, and this won't come as a surprise to this group, private sector capabilities are improving fast, and sensors are increasingly more capable, and private sensors are increasingly more capable at comparable cost. So it's not surprising that the private sector is improving and providing great services. What is interesting is that they are growing and improving in areas that were previously the exclusive domain of government. For example, they can now combine multiple phenomenologies, i.e. data from sensors that are optical and radar, to produce insights that previously only the government used to be able to. Going forward, if we need to hide our assets in space, we have to do it in plain sight. Next, I wanted to talk about, again, going a little bit deeper into the issue of private sector. We saw a growing number of private companies in Europe, Japan, and Australia, and they all have global investors. However, while governments in these countries would like to work with private entities, they see SSA as an inherently governmental function. In fact, very military-oriented, and they will not outsource to private companies, something that we see being talked about often in the United States. Last but not least, we spent some time looking at the oversight, coordination, and management function, what's traditionally called space traffic STM. We found a lot of discomfort around a global STM system, especially if it's led by the United States. Based on our work, we believe it isn't very likely that there will be a formal STM regime in place in the next decade or so. What will likely be more likely is that we will see informal agreements, best practices, guidelines, and standards in place on issues such as orbital debris mitigation or satellite servicing and others. I have a lot more I can say, but I would like to turn the field over to my colleagues here, and then hopefully we'll have a great discussion.
Great, thanks, Pavia. And as she said, there are more slides and from the IDA report on the events website if you wish to download and flip through them. And thanks, Victoria.
Sure. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you. Okay, try it again. First time I've done this. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, CSIS, for inviting me to speak here. I'm really pleased to be part of this great panel. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm with the Secure World Foundation. We're a private operating foundation that focuses on the sustainable use of outer space. We're very interested in SSA because it is foundational to international cooperation and to the continued use of outer space. We have hosted an invitation-only dialogue at the AMOS conference, which is an SSA conference held in Maui every year. And I just want to talk really briefly about our experience with that, because I think it really tracks how the discussion about SSA has evolved within the policy community. Our first AMOS dialogue was in 2013, and we just basically talked about, okay, what's out there? What sort of SSA capabilities are there, both government and commercial? Our next one looks specifically at the difference between government SSA and commercial SSA to see, okay, what sort of capabilities are there, how they differ, are there gaps, are there overcoverages, things of that nature. Then our next dialogue talked about, just in broad terms, space traffic management. What kind of SSA do we need in order to make sure that space traffic management more accurately reflects the space domain as it currently exists? Then we looked at small sats and the special challenges that they provide for SSA capabilities, and what sort of improvements do we need to ensure that small sats can operate in a safe and sustainable manner. Then we finally looked at SSA, how it supports future space traffic management regimes with our good colleagues from STIFI. We worked on scenarios with them on that and had an interesting discussion about what was most realistic and most desirable. And then finally, this past, actually just last month, we had a discussion looking at on-orbit servicing, rendezvous and proximity operations. What sort of SSA capabilities are needed, and can the commercial sector provide that? And if not, what sort of needs do the government need to do to be able to prove that? So I think this kind of tracks, just kind of independently where the conversation's going. It reflects that SSA definitely has a commercial aspect. It reflects that there are new uses of space that are challenging our current SSA and STM setup, and it reflects that there's kind of an international element to that. So along those lines, I also want to discuss, as Pavia said, there's an increased interest internationally in sharing, I won't say burden, but responsibility for SSA. Secure World hosted a workshop in India just in June. We were approached by some people there that said, look, India is a major actor in space. We're doing a lot of launching. We want to be a responsible actor. We want to contribute to SSA, we're just not sure what the best thing to do is. And I think a lot of countries have some sort of SSA capability inherently. I think a lot of them think you need to have 20 radars in order to have SSA capability, and that's not the case. If you have a really good telescope in the right place, that can contribute to an overall networked SSA capability. So we had a discussion there. Just last week in Bremen at the International Astronautical Congress, there's an MOU signed between the International Astronautical Federation, the International Institute of Space Law, and the International Academy of Astronautics. Basically where they said, STM is important. The United States is working on STM, and basically they said, we will join in a cooperative initiative to develop comprehensive approaches and proposals for STM to be addressed to decision makers on national and international level in order to promote the safe use of outer space. So again, nothing too meaty there, but there's a recognition that there's a responsibility, and they are interested in meeting that responsibility there. As well, space traffic management has become an agenda item in the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the legal subcommittee. And then also, I think the idea, one of the big challenges for SSA, and I think that the United States really needs to figure out how we're going to handle that, is we always talk about the challenging for sharing data and for transparency. Just recently, a bunch of data was released into the catalog about analyst satellites, or analyst objects. And which is good because in one way it helps increase transparency. These were objects that previously had not been in spacetrack.org. But on the other hand, there was no real coordination with 18th Space Command to let people know that this is going to be entering the catalog, and software that analyzes this information basically had to be very quickly rewritten at the very last minute. So it just indicates there is an interest in the United States part for transparency, which I wholeheartedly applaud. But the U.S. military also has some work to do in terms of making sure things are coordinated ahead of time. And if we are going to have truly international SSA, that is something that needs to be worked on as well. Just a couple other things really quickly. I would like to reflect as well, one of the big challenges for the space domain, and that will also be a challenge for SSA, is just the inherent change from, I think, state actors to commercial actors. I know this has been said many times, but let me reemphasize this. You know, every time you read about these mega constellations, there's going to be 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. Obviously, not that many are going to be launched. But they are inherently shifting the way the domain is going to be, from one that is state actors to commercial actors. And that's going to change how we deal with these international discussions, because international fora are largely based on state actors, and they aren't very good at incorporating the commercial actors. But if we really want the stakeholders to be involved in these discussions, we need to figure out a way to do that. And then finally, I'd just like to emphasize again that the use of space is starting to outpace policy and law, and we see that with SSA. So it's important to try and get ahead of these things before decisions get made for us. And just like to emphasize one last time that the responsible and cooperative use of space is crucial for space flight safety. This is an important discussion to be having. I'm really pleased that CSIS is promoting this sort of discussion. I look forward to continuing the conversation with everyone during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Audrey?
Thanks, Caitlin, and thank you to CSIS for hosting this panel and inviting me to speak. This is actually the second time, I think, in almost as many months that I've been on a panel exclusively of women, and I just wanted to note that I think it's really great to see not only the growing representation of women, but also the recognition of them in the aerospace and defense field. So thanks. So as the token government person on the panel today, I guess I just wanted to step back a little bit and even just reframe our conversation in terms of why we're even having it. You know, why did the government develop and publish a space policy directive on space traffic management? I mean, the first one really of its kind. And maybe all of this is old hat. I know it's certainly known to many of you in the audience, but I just did want to step back for just a minute and kind of talk about some of the broader trends that we're seeing in space that really has driven the government toward considering this topic more seriously, and to talk a little bit about DoD's perspective of it, as well as our role in space traffic management. So first, I think it's pretty well understood by now that DoD is a key stakeholder in spaceflight safety, but I like to repeat this point every time I'm on a panel because I just want to remind the audience that we also have a stake in a safe and predictable space environment. We are today one of the largest actors in space in terms of just frankly numbers of satellites. Now, while that is certainly going to change probably pretty quickly here, we will continue to be, I think, one of the most diverse users of space in terms of different orbital regimes, different applications, the different ways in which we will continue to use space for, frankly, a variety of functions that we rely on to keep safe, you know, our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our Marines, and maybe one day our Space Forces, although that's the first and last thing I'm going to say on the Space Force today. So we, just like any other operator, right, whether civil or commercial, we rely on space and on our satellites to keep our satellites safe, whether from indiscriminate harm from space debris or more deliberate malicious acts. But that environment that we operate in is about to change dramatically. And I want to quote an aerospace corporation report that was recently done for the government, and to be honest, I'm not actually sure whether it's publicly available or not. But there's a quote in here that I am just like floored by every single time I read it, and so I want to share it with you. And it talks about the changing sort of commercial role, which Bhavya and Victoria both mentioned already, the changing role of commercial in space. And what they say is just 19 companies, when taken together, have proposed placing well over 20,000 satellites in orbit in the next 10 years. And then they go on to say, for perspective, less than 8,100 payloads have been placed in Earth's orbit in the entire history of the space age, with only 4,700 of them remaining in orbit, of which approximately 1,800 are still active. So, and then they conclude, although perhaps many, or perhaps most, of these large, proposed constellations may never be launched, if just half of those proposals are successful, the traffic created would more than double the number of payloads launched in the last 60 years and create more than 6 times the number of active satellites. So I know it was kind of a long quote, so just to sort of put a fine point on it, if half of the commercial ventures are successful, we will double the amount of satellites put into orbit over the entire history of the space age in just the next 10 years, right? So talk about an incredible step function, if you will, in the space environment today. And now there's, of course, 2 really big commercial ventures, in the 4,000 number. SpaceX is one, Samsung is another. But there's a lot more to get you up to that 20,000 number, right? A lot of proposals in the sort of hundreds range. And that, frankly, to me, just sort of boggles my mind, right, in terms of thinking about the way that space traffic management really needs to change from the historical paradigm and looking into the future. And that quote wasn't looking at all about the types of applications, but just purely the number of satellites on orbit. But really, we also have to think about how the character of space activities is changing as well. And this is going to change, that I think is going to happen a little bit more slowly, but it is going to be a more kind of fundamental shift to the way we look at activities in space and the need to manage traffic. And I have this analogy that I want to try out on you all. The analogy is to my 10-month-old, okay? I have a 10-month-old son at home, right? Now, he's 10 months old, so right now when he plays, even if he's with other kids, he doesn't play with other kids, right? It's what they call parallel play, right? He plays near other kids, but they're not interactive at all. So he goes, and runs and chases his red ball this way, and another kid goes and runs and chases his blue ball that way. And of course, we need to make sure that the kids don't collide, when my son's off chasing his blue ball and the other kid is off chasing his red ball. But at the end of the day, the 2 kids aren't really interactive, right? They just happen to be occupying the same space and have goals that take them, into potential conjunctions, if you will. But as my son gets older, he's going to start actually playing with other kids, and then it is about the same ball being chased by 2 different kids, or 2 different kids passing a ball back and forth to one another. And of course, the analogy sort of breaks down a little bit when you're talking about space, but the point is, it's not just sort of a bunch of individual satellites pursuing individual objectives and having to watch out for the traffic. Now you've got interaction going on between multiple users, which again creates a more complicated problem. And so then the last trend in terms of why we're so focused on the issue is just the amount of data that's out there right now. And again, this is something that the panel's really already touched on, so I won't spend a whole lot of time. In the government, we tend to focus on our new sensors that are coming online, such as Space Fence, which of course is going to enable us to track objects much smaller than we ever have before. But I personally think that really the dramatic transformation is going to come from what the private sector is doing in terms of sort of these distributed networks of, in many cases, much less capable sensors that when put together create powerful new just views of what's going on in space. And the analogy I would use there is how, Digital Globe plus Google, brought us Google Earth and ubiquitous imagery of the Earth. And I think companies like Exoanalytics plus AGI and many others are going to do the same for space in the coming years. So I know I've probably run on too long with just that introductory piece. I do want to spend just a minute or two about what all this means, for the Department of Defense. I think everyone's pretty well aware that today we, DoD, provide space situational awareness and spaceflight safety services to both US and foreign operators. And in addition to the emergency close approach notifications that we provide to anyone who has a predicted conjunction within our screening volumes, we also have now what we call advanced service agreements with 70 companies and 18 countries, which is frankly an astonishing number from my perspective. And we, DoD, have been able to manage that responsibility, admittedly a little bit haltingly at first, because of the SSA infrastructure that we have had for a number of years that's grounded in our missile warning infrastructure. But from our perspective, it really is time to transition that responsibility to a civil agency. All these trends that I've been talking about in terms of the way that the character and nature of space activities is changing is going to increase this traffic management burden in the future. And quite frankly, this spaceflight safety function, which we are fully committed to because, as I said before, we are also one of the largest operators, it's not really inherently a military function. So we really do think now is the time to transition that function to the Department of Commerce, which is what's called out in the policy. Another aspect where DoD is involved is in what SPD3 calls the development of space traffic standards and best practices, including technical guidance, technical guidelines, safety standards, norms of behavior, and orbital conjunction protocols. Again, we welcome those developments, especially because from a military perspective, having more rules of the road that are commonly followed by, frankly, all space actors make it easier for us to detect potential threats, right? It makes it easier to know what's abnormal when everyone agrees on what's normal. So having more established rules of the road allows, or not allows us, but helps us do our indication and warning mission as well. And then just looking even more broadly, if you look through the goals of SPD3, there are a number of essentially tasks laid out in there for the government. And DoD is involved, I think, in just about every single one of those tasks, whether it's looking at how we update our orbital debris mitigation standards, which are standards that DoD also follows, or how we improve our U.S. registry of space objects, which are, again, DoD objects are registered alongside civil and commercial objects as well, or the more familiar aspects of the policy, which I already talked about in terms of transitioning spaceflight safety and creating the database for spaceflight safety services. So with that, I know I've probably run on too long, but I'm happy to answer your questions and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. I want to note that we will be taking questions in person here, but also if you are watching online, we have a website that you can go to and ask a question online, and I will be taking those as well so that we can engage with those who could not make it in person. I do want to take a little moderator's privilege and ask the first one or two questions to our panelists. I was really struck by all of your comments and following on these rules of the road that SPD3 lines out, and tying in with how Javier said that other countries are really hesitant to work with the United States or to rely on the United States solely for SSA capabilities. How do we move forward with these other countries and commercial stakeholders to develop these rules of the road and make sure that they're universally accepted?
Go ahead.
No, if you want to go for it.
I guess I would just say that I think one of the instincts we have is kind of holding our kimono tight, as in we really, these are national security assets, we don't want to share anymore. I think given growing global transparency and our inability to hide things, we could just as well do that. We just need to make sure that we share more. Maybe there is need for some sort of a safe, instead of sort of the traditional DoD catalog, more of a space safety catalog, which ensures that we can get data from all these entities who are eager to make a contribution. I mean, I think that was one of our big findings, that other countries and even private entities outside the United States are incredibly eager to provide their information to share. So let's be able to ingest all of that data, whether it's from other governments or U.S. private vendors. I mean, as I said, and as I think my panelists also reiterated, U.S. commercial capabilities are growing at an enormous rate. So let's try to see how we can all work together in this sort of this safety database format and be able to have more information.
Sure. So, Caitlin, you're asking about sort of rules of the road and how we can work together to create those. And so I have the personal experience of having been involved for about 8 years in the development of the long-term sustainability guidelines by the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, which was a long, protracted, exciting, but also difficult negotiation at times, which ended somewhat inconclusively a couple of months ago. And so this is an example of, as Victoria was saying, a sort of a state actor forum where we in the United States tried very hard to make sure that our private sector was involved and informing the positions that we brought forward, but that wasn't necessarily the case for all countries. So that's one drawback of kind of those state-on-state approaches. The other that I would just highlight from having had this experience in the UN is, the UN is a diplomatic body, and even if it's a committee called, the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, ultimately there's really nothing scientific or technical really being negotiated. At the end of the day, these are countries coming together to work on political commitments in diplomatic forums. And so it helps in these diplomatic forums if you have something sort of already baked that's technically credible and that's been built from the bottom up that can be essentially presented to these diplomatic forums, negotiated truly, and elevated to the right level for a political commitment on behalf of a nation state. And so drawing on that experience, I believe that the way to have an inclusive process for building rules and norms and standards for space is frankly to start with really that technical foundation through primarily industry-led approaches, but those that also include government actors as well. There are a number of standard-setting bodies such as ISO, CCSDS. There's even the CONFERS project that DARPA is running for standards related to on-orbit servicing. And all of these mechanisms together can produce that technical grounding that then can be adopted sort of on a voluntary basis by companies, by governments, and then really be brought into the international environment for adoption at a more political level. But I think if if we start, sort of at that political level and attempt to work our way back down, that's where you really get, that's where challenges arise. Thanks.
Yes, I agree. But I will take issue I would like to applaud the work that was done in the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space and long-term sustainability guidelines. I think Audrey, you and the U.S. government did a great job incorporating the private sector. But I would like to emphasize that 87 countries came to consensus on 21 guidelines, where consensus was not reached and how it was going to be reported to the UN, was going to be in a resolution or what have you. So that was a little disappointing. But I think the fact that 87 countries reached consensus, that's a great start, and that shows there is an appetite for that sort of approach. Audrey also mentioned, and so I think it's something that's a good start. She mentioned CONFERS. It's a consortium for execution of rendezvous and servicing operations. Even though Secure World is a subcontract on that, I have to look up the acronym every single time. But the idea is, as Audrey said, the idea is that you want to have commercial entities involved in setting these best practices for RPO activities. And I think that it really indicates that the commercial sector recognizes that either they set these practices up or they'll be set up for them. And it's to their benefit to make sure that they are involved in the conversation. And also, like the Global VSAT Forum has a set of guidelines looking for best practices. Satellite Industry Association was working on one at one point. And so I think there's not going to just be one approach. There's not going to be one set of guidelines that's going to be helpful. You're going to come at it for SSA sharing and from our close approach activities and data sharing and that sort of thing. And as a whole, it's just going to have a holistic sort of discussion about what these best practices are. But I think there definitely is interest and work being done that can be shared about that.
And just hearing that the UN's resolution took 8 years to complete, I worry about, as you said, Victoria, the use of space is outpacing our policy and law. And so what kind of time frame do you guys think maybe we need to put on ourselves to enact this before we are outpaced and decisions are being made before us or post incident?
I think the real timeline is going to be driven by the mega constellations. And then also if you have human commercial space flight, which in theory is going to happen the next year or so. start that. And then I think the mega constellations in the next couple of years. And then the other big change, I think, is the new use of space, active debris removal. You look at companies like Astroscale, I think they're going to have their first launch in the next year and a half or so. So we're looking at a couple years. I don't think that we're going to get to that point in terms of policy and law, but maybe it's nice to have an incentive.
And I want to open up questions to the audience, if anyone has one. Teresa? Oh, we have, microphones coming towards you so that the people on the webcast can hear as well.
Could you please stand?
Yeah.
Hi, you guys know me. I'm Teresa Hitchens from the University of Maryland. I have a question for Pavia about the study. I was interested, you sort of brushed by and said that countries are interested in cooperating, collaborating, and not only with the United States. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of those permutations of cooperation. Particularly, I'm interested in cooperation with China. But I also wanted to note that, as Victoria, as you all know, that Russia made a proposal at COPUS for a UN data sharing body that did not go down well with the West for various reasons, and one of which is that when you try to do something like that from the top down at the UN, the costs involved and the political difficulties are mighty. I worked at the UN for 6 years, and I can vouch for that. But the concept in and of itself of some kind of international database, maybe for safety, that's different than the current catalogs, doesn't seem to me to be a bad idea. So I'd like to ask everyone to address that and the practicalities or non-practicalities of that. There are bodies that are not UN bodies that do those sorts of things. The one for the geosatellites, whose name I always forget. Yeah, for geosatellites, where the geosynchronous orbit satellites, where people are cooperating in the international. Yeah, that. I always forget the acronym. But there are other models than a UN model, and so I'd like folks to address that. Okay, thank you.
So with respect to partnerships, we saw partnerships that do not include the United States, or include the United States as one of many other actors. One is the EU SST, Space Surveillance and Tracking System, which is trying very hard to have the European Union be independently be able to have all aspects of SSA capabilities. For China, I mentioned APOSOS and APSCO, and again, they are trying to increase their membership, and none of the countries are the U.S. or the U.S. allied partners. So there's sort of these regional networks that are growing across the world. So that's something to think about. And one interesting point is we kind of graphically represented these networks, and one thing we found that countries like South Africa or Chile are at the center of many of these networks because they provide sensors, locations for very important sensor data collection. So that's something to think about. And the other side point there is that many of the countries we spoke to mentioned how difficult it was to sign data sharing agreements with the United States. So that makes it a barrier. So I'm not sure what other questions you had, so I'll maybe let my colleagues go and then return if there's something else I can answer.
Yes, Teresa, I heard about the Russian proposal as well. I think it's always fun to propose new things, but let's work with the stuff we have currently. There is a registry that you're supposed to do with the United Nations for satellite. Maybe we should focus on compliance with that first. I think there's always an interest in doing that sort of new stuff, but there's a lot of existing best practices that are not always being followed, and I think it would demonstrate good intent for future cooperative efforts if people followed what is currently being asked of them.
And just kind of building, I guess, on what Victoria said, one of the things that the policy talks about is establishing an open architecture for our SSA data repository, which, is talked about in the policy, understandably, in terms of how that enables us, the U.S., to what we call ingest, data from a variety of sources, so that we do have the ability to incorporate commercial or partner data into both the catalog that we have, as well as the actual conjunction assessment information. But establishing an open data architecture requires you to have data standards that allow for interoperability. And so I think, Teresa, to your point, while some sort of international or UN database may be a number of years off, the foundation for an activity like that really is data interoperability and data standards. So I'm not going to comment specifically on the Russian proposal or sort of where I think that international conversation is going, but rather to say that I think what we're doing now, as Victoria sort of mentioned, with what we've got, so to speak, can pave the way for more cooperation in the future.
Great. I'm going to take one from online real quick, and then we'll return back to the in-person. We've talked about how the different parts of the U.S. government are involved, different governments, internationally, commercial, but how can academia play a role and help, solve these issues or bring together forums?
I guess one thing we learned in our study is how many knowledge gaps we have, how little we understand about the movement of objects in space. So I think that academia has to play a huge role in terms of bridging those gaps. In fact, Audrey mentioned SPD3. SPD3 talks about the need for an SNT, an intra-governmental SNT, or maybe a global SNT strategy. And I think that would be a really good idea. We should go forward with that.
I mean, just building on that, I think one of the big issues when people talk about SSA is they always assume, okay, well, we need to have more sensors. And really, it's an issue of big data analytics. Do we even know how to use the data that we're getting right now? I think that's where academic institutions could absolutely play a role in making that information usable and useful to all stakeholders.
And a question right here in the front.
Thank you, Audrey. I love your red ball, blue ball analogy. And let me extrapolate from that to the issue of commercial regulation. What if the parent of the blue ball has a stricter regimen than the parent of the red ball? How do you reconcile that from all of you? How do you reconcile that from the standpoint of U.S. regulatory policy, particularly what's now emerging in terms of the reform issues?
So I'll just start by saying, it's really important when we talk about regulation to recognize where U.S. does have regulatory authority and where we don't have regulatory authority. And there are many companies who have chosen to be licensed outside of the United States for their operations. Meaning that the U.S. may or may not have jurisdiction and control and the ability to actually direct them to move. So when we think about, what's implicit in your question in terms of some sort of broader sort of, either national or supranational sort of regulatory structure, we really have to recognize that it's, in many cases, multiple governments even that are in play. So it's really actually quite a tricky discussion, and one that I think we've got to work a little bit more in-house in the U.S. to figure out how we even just regulate all of these new commercial ventures that are coming online today, which is something that the policy also recognizes, before we start talking about what kind of broader international regime might be appropriate. I think in the interim, though, we have excellent coordination between owner-operators, and I think that's one of the things that someone mentioned the SDA, but also the work that the U.S. has done in terms of helping to bring together operators that have a potential conjunction so that they can work their issue out kind of on a bilateral, if you will, basis. And I think that's probably where things are going to stay for a number of years.
To answer your question, yeah, you absolutely do not want to have flags of convenience where people are forum shopping for different regulations. But I think a lot also depends on what you're trying to regulate. To be honest, the United States is leading the way in terms of commercial SSA, and so I think probably what we will do will have a ripple effect. Other countries will probably look at what we're doing and build on it. So I don't anticipate it being entirely that different from what we do. But also, you need to look at what other countries are trying to regulate. Are they trying to regulate satellite networks? Are they trying to regulate launch? And that's going to affect what sort of regulations they have. And so I think it's really hard to have a one-size-fits-all sort of response for that. But definitely, I think it's helpful to keep in mind that countries, as Audrey said, companies have options. We want to make sure that we are able to follow Article 6 responsibilities of continuing supervision of activities of U.S. companies.
I think part of what we have to do is to educate the parent of the red ball. Sorry, Tiger Mom. So I mean, I'm not joking. Actually, I'm on a COSPAR committee on looking at scientific applications of CubeSats, and I was talking to one of the other representatives on the committee, and I was talking about orbital debris issues related to CubeSats, and he said, space is big. Don't worry about it. And this is not a representative from a country that has no assets in space. This was a colleague from Israel. So I think part of it is, I think the quote that Audrey read about the upcoming challenges, I think we need to do a better job getting some of that information across. So if that report you mentioned, Audrey, is not public, it ought to be public.
It is public?
Oh, okay.
Just,
Sure, because the distribution statement on the front says it's not.
I definitely have read that, so it's on their website. Another one from online. Given the improving SSA capabilities of private firms and other governments, can the U.S. military realistically expect to be able to continue hiding sensitive national security satellites?
No.
Yeah.
I think the reality is finally starting to sink in with a lot of folks that space is becoming more transparent than ever. And Victoria mentioned the release of, I think it was 500, I don't have the exact number in front of me, 500 something analyst objects, which previously hadn't been in the catalog because their origin was unknown, and it was sort of just like a process issue where we weren't releasing objects whose origins we couldn't trace, but we recognized that there's really, from a spaceflight safety perspective, a need for as many objects as possible to be in the catalog. So we are, like I said, slowly but surely transforming the way we do business, because we recognize not only that the environment has changed in terms of the demand signal growing for these spaceflight safety services, but also because the transparency is changing as well. So I really can't say anything more, I guess, than that. But I do think the recognition is there. It's just going to take us a little bit of time to figure out how we operate in this new environment.
Right. I think it just, I've said this so many times, I think space is going to knee-jerk classified. And a lot of times it does not need to be. They used to be able to get away with it. As Audrey said, they can't anymore. But it does reflect a big shift of thinking, and I anticipate it will take a while for that to bear out in reality in terms of practice and operations.
Great, thank you.
I guess I would say to that, I would obviously agree with everything Audrey and Victoria said. But I think one thing to note is because the United States is a gold standard, we tend to underestimate other countries or other entities' capabilities, even though they are, I think we just need to recognize that they are good enough and they can do things that we don't anticipate that they can do. So we should move forward with that recognition.
Right here in the front in the blue jacket. Thanks.
Name and affiliation. Okay. Hi, I'm Dan Mosqueda from SRI International, and as you talk about some of the infrastructure, really the stuff is what goes through my mind. Like, for instance, SRI spun off, and we still host Leo Labs, which certainly can see much smaller than anything the Air Force can at this point. Once the fence comes on, that'll change. But even so, when I was at Space Command, and I'm sure you would agree with this, sir, the problem was processing all the data. So to your knowledge, is anybody looking at the quantum initiatives, for instance, as a way to do this? Because there are so many objects that we just can't even process or do anything with at this point. That you can bring on all the sensors you want, but if you can't characterize what they are and identify, it's going to be a lot of data just falling to the floor.
I guess I have been speaking from our study. We did not think that any of the countries we looked at had capabilities that were as good as in the United States for the processing piece. But I would let my colleagues comment on capabilities in the United States.
I mean, I think it's going to be a big concern as the space fence and other things come online, just the idea that the catalog is going to be overwhelmed. And as I mentioned earlier, the software to analyze things that are in spacetrack.org assumes that there's only a certain number of objects, and when stuff gets over it, it freaks out. And I know the Air Force has been working on trying to fix that for a while, and they have not had much luck. I think we're on the third iteration of the latest fix. So it's an issue. I don't know that, I think it may be one of those things where our hands can be forced when faced with reality.
Great. One from online. The space policy directives have been a great start from the administration, but they're just one component. Some aspects still require legislative language. So what, from your perspective, is needed legislatively to move forward with any of these initiatives?
I guess it's me. I mean, when we talk about who's in charge of SSA for the United States, I mean, the White House can say what they want, but really the legislative authority needs to be done by Congress, and that's really where push is going to come to shove, who's going to be tasked with that. And right now, there's a dispute between the Senate and the House sides in terms of whether it should be commerce or transportation. So that still definitely needs to be worked out. Not clear where it's going to end up.
Thanks.
I guess I was thinking a little more broadly, which I didn't really want to speak to, but on the specific issue that Victoria raises, I mean, DoD has right now the responsibility to be sharing this SSA spaceflight safety data with commercial and foreign operators. And so to Victoria's point, I mean, if, as SPD 3 says, the Department of Commerce is designated to be the entity to do that in the future, we're going to have to figure out how we either change the legislation or address it through other means to enable DoD not to be the storefront anymore for that data.
Question?
Hi, Bruce McDonald, Johns Hopkins SICE. I was encouraged, Audrey, in particular, your comments that there's more acceptance, it sounds like, within the Department of Defense for rules of the road. But it brings to mind a question that in the Obama administration, within the Defense Department, there was a fair amount of pushback on the idea of a code of conduct. And it's not that big a jump to go from rules of the road to a code of conduct. And so I wanted to ask, is there any residual resistance to the idea of rules of the road? I mean, despite all the good arguments for it, because, you know, that it might constrain U.S. flexibility and options. And is the idea of code of conduct completely dead, or is it on life support, or just dead? Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. So first I'll just say the Department of Defense is not a monolith. You know, with millions of people working for the organization, you can't say that everyone's view, you know, has changed overnight. So yes, of course, there are still a variety of perspectives in a very large organization. But what you'll hear from the very top, General Hyten in particular has been very vocal, talking about the need for norms of behavior in outer space, precisely for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. You know, if we don't know what's normal, then it makes our job of detecting potentially hostile acts that much more difficult. Now, then I think when you start to get into the details is I think where we can have a really robust discussion about what's appropriate. In my mind, there's a pretty big gulf between technically driven, bottoms up standards and guidelines for safe and sustainable space operations, and, you know, a top-down political commitment for, you know, sort of, what's the right way, like of, you know, like code of conduct for behavior in outer space. That's a pretty big gulf there. And I think this administration's approach has really been more of those bottoms-up, technically driven standards, where we hope that industry and civil actors can play a leading role, because the same rules that are going to be good for safety, or the rules that are going to be applicable for safety purposes, are going to be applicable for all actors. It's only when you start getting into the trickier subjects of sort of what's hostile or what's irresponsible, what's aggressive, that you start to get into more difficult and frankly political discussions. And so I think if we're able to keep our focus, frankly, where I think it ought to be, given the dramatic change just from the private sector in terms of both the number and the character, as I mentioned before, of space activities, I think that action will actually bear a lot of fruit, that although it may not directly sort of derive from the top-down political approach, will actually inform and I think strengthen stability and security in space, because everyone will sort of be operating, everyone on the road. I mean, well, in DC, nobody really follows traffic laws, but in many, many other parts of the country, if everyone on the road is following the same traffic laws, and then another car sort of comes out of the blue or makes a left against a red or something like that, then that gives you, sort of the ability to quickly identify that action and focus on it.
Yeah, Bruce, I mean, the idea of the European Union proposed code of conduct is dead, gone, buried, disintegrating. But they, I was in Europe a few weeks ago talking to the European External Action Service, and it's interesting, their takeaway from this was that it was not inherently a bad thing, but they are criticized for the process largely, and some of the content, and they feel they're criticized for having the discussion outside the United Nations. And so they argue, from their perspective, there still is a need for a global set of voluntary norms. But they think, okay, if we're going to do it again, maybe it could be done with the United Nations General Assembly resolution. But they're saying, if that's going to happen, it has to be inclusive as possible, so they want it to be the UN. It cannot be the EU who proposes it, because they're not a member state of the United Nations. And you need to have a wide variety of supporters in terms of developed and developing countries, because that was one of the criticisms of the Code of Conduct, that it appeared to be by the West for the West. I don't agree with that, but that was a criticism that was made that had a lot of traction with some from the Global South. And so their opinion is that this is a possibility that it could happen in the future, but we're going to have to wait and see what they end up actually being able to do.
We're close to our time, but I did want to ask a question, and maybe Audrey would want to sit this one out, but we'll see. I think realistically, we've talked about a lot today, identification, data sharing, and processing, norms and regulations. What is one key area that the United States government needs to prioritize?
I would say creation of a space safety database.
I would say the idea of figuring out a way to both share data and ingest data from non-U.S. government sources is going to be a huge deal. And if we can't figure it out, we're not going to be able to do the next iteration of SSA.
So, Caitlin, I won't exactly answer your question, because I think it would be strange for me, because the SPD 3, the Space Policy Directive 3, has 9 goals in it, and I wouldn't want to choose any of my children to love any more than any other one. But to answer your question and maybe sort of get off the stage, I think the most important thing we can prioritize or focus on is actually doing these things. To some degree, I think we've got to generate a little bit of momentum. Like I said, this is the first time the government has ever had a space traffic management policy, and I think we've got to start showing success and showing gains to sort of build that momentum and really coalesce some of the movement happening in this space to the benefit of all. Thanks.
Great. And any last minute questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you. Micheline Tabash, European Space Agency, but I am really speaking, I think, on an individual basis here. So everybody agrees we need a database, we need to share, we need the internationals and all that, and I think there's no argument there. But don't you, I also appreciated what Audrey was saying, that the DoD needs to move a little bit more towards transparency. It's going to take time, it's hard and all that. But isn't the message that we keep hearing now in Washington, that space is a war domain and we need a space force, isn't that going to blur or disturb that other work?
So I guess in short, my answer would be, I hope not. I think that the recognition that space is a warfighting domain is something that has been somewhat long overdue. I mean, space, as we said, even in the 2011 National Security Space Strategy, space is contested. There are threats to our activities in space, and to the extent that we continue to rely on the use of space to support our military forces around the world and support our way of life, those satellites are going to be threatened. And so I think what we've just done in this administration is sort of say out loud something that folks have really known for a number of years. And in terms of whether there's a Space Force or not, which I said I didn't really want to talk about, whatever happens, I think is largely just going to be a reorganization of the elements that we have within the Department of Defense, with, of course, some changes. But I mean, we already have space capabilities within all of the branches of the military today who are providing benefits to, like I said, our soldiers, sailors, and airmen and Marines around the world.
Well, one analogy I was thinking about when you asked that question, Micheline, is the maritime domain, right? I mean, in the oceans, we have aircraft carriers, but we also collaborate. We protect the biodiversity. We do science and technology. We explore. So maybe there's some lessons to be learned from other domains where we can do all of the above. Something to think about.
I mean, I think absolutely the United States could be better on our messaging. I think with the Space Force, it sends, without any kind of contextual discussion, the wrong idea can be gotten as in terms of what is actually being done, because really what is just acquisition and reorganization. Having said that, I think it does reflect the way that space is being used. It is a key national security enabler, but not just for the United States. It's happening all around the world. Again, I was just in my discussions in Europe, I was talking to a guy from ESA, and one of the main programs there, as you know, is space and security, in which back in the day you would never even hear security discussed in terms of civil space, but is a recognition that is a key part of that sort of capability. And so I think it's just part of a larger discussion about how we can ensure that space is usable for the long term, but it just needs to be done perhaps in a manner that is less inflammatory.
I also have a thought on this, and it's, SPD3 is moving, hopefully, the SSA capabilities to commerce. And I think that separation from DoD to commerce will also help clear up that distinction that SSA capabilities are for, everyone, not just military-based. So hopefully that would help as well. I want to thank our panelists for being here and for providing great insight. And thank you all for joining us today. It's been great to have you.